Hello everyone, good morning. Sharing my screen. We need to get started with building our first integration in OIC, guys. So we'll go back and discuss the use case. So we would start off with our first integration in OIC, and we're going to build this integration as a REST API. We are going to create this integration as a REST API. And what is it that we're going to do in this REST API? So we will start off with a simple use case. So we'll build a REST API, which will take in first name as input, and that first name is of data type string. We need to prefix hello to it. We need to prefix hello to it and send that back as a response. Okay, so we're going to build a simple REST API to start off with. And this REST API would take first name as input, prefix hello, and send it back as a response. And for this integration, remember guys, before you build any integration, what is the first step that we need to do, guys? We cannot build an integration directly in OIC. I mean, we cannot start off with an integration build directly. Instead, we need to create the required connections first, and then we need to proceed with a build. Now, why are we starting off with a simple use case like this, guys? Because when you build an integration in OIC, there would be a lot of steps that you have to perform in it. There would be a lot of steps that you have to perform in it. You need to create the required connections first. You need to build the integration. You need to enable tracking. You need to activate it. And then you have to test the integration from within OIC instance and from outside of OIC instance as well. So there are around 6 to 7 steps that you have to perform whenever you create an integration in OIC. Okay, so I want you to focus on that, on those 6 or 7 steps and get used to that integration development workflow since we are starting off with a simple use case. Now you guys need to tell me, for this particular integration, do we need to talk to any external system, guys, like ERP cloud, or do we have to talk to Salesforce or database here for this use case? Yes or no?
No.
We don't have to, right? And after we build the REST API, should client be able to trigger it or not? After we build the REST API, client should be able to trigger it, and they should be able to pass in first name as input, and they need to get back a response. So what's the only connection that we need for this integration? We need a trigger connection for this integration. And since we want to build the integration as a REST API, we are going to create that trigger connection. We are going to create that trigger connection with a REST adapter in it. So let's go back and get started with the integration. So I'm back in OIC, and within OIC instance, there are 2 places where you can build integrations, guys. We can build integrations directly in the design screen by going into design integrations, and we can also build integrations within the projects as well. On what basis do we decide whether to build the integrations in the design screen or in the project screen, guys? What's going to determine that? We already discussed it in day 2 session itself.
Projects.
Yeah. My question is, on what basis you decide whether you need projects or whether you can build integrations directly in the design screen?
To restrict access.
Yes. So the question that you need to ask is, how many integration teams that your client has? How many integration teams that your client has? So if your client has only one integration team, and the team is building, let's say there are around 4 to 10 members in that team, and these team members are building integrations related to Financials Cloud. There's only one team, client is implementing only financials, then in such case, where do you build the integrations, guys? Even if the integration is created one by one member is visible to the other members, that is not a problem. There's only one team. In such case, where do you build the integrations? Since there is no need to do access control, there's only one team, then we go to design screen and we build the integrations directly in the design screen. Because when you go into design screen, when Prasad logs in, his user will be applied as a filter. But when he takes out his username, you see, initially you see 55 integrations. I take out my filter, I see 776. So which means even if we don't, what do you call, even if we don't do this, I mean, even if there is no access control, that is completely fine. Even if there is no access control, that is completely fine. Okay, so what is it that we need to do? Even if there is no access control, that's fine because there's only one team, in which case clients can build the integration directly from design screen. But what if your client has multiple integration teams based on offerings? Your client might have separate teams, one for financials, another for HCM, a third one for SCM, or a client might have operations in multiple countries and you're doing different projects. Okay, so all the integrations related for UK business unit, you have a separate team looking after it. US, you have a different team. Gulf, you have a different team. So if you have multiple integration teams, doesn't matter how they are partitioned by, could be by offering or could be by country, you would definitely have a requirement to do access control. So client might say, in the finance team, if there are 4 members and in the HCM team, you've got 3 members, the obvious thing that client would say is, whatever integrations that Prasad is going to create from our finance team should not be visible to Divya or Kiran because they are from HCM team. And in such cases, you cannot achieve this access control if you build the integrations in design screen. That's when you make use of project. So I'm going to create a new project for your batch. So I go into projects. And in the project, I'm going to create a new project for your batch. Give it a name. And I'm going to use a name as UG80, which is going to be your batch identifier. So whatever components I'm going to create for your batch, I'll put it into this project. So when you guys practice the components that we are building in the session, don't put the components into this project. In fact, you cannot do it. I'm going to give you view only access to it. But don't put your components into this project. Instead, all of you, please create a project with your own name. Not the full name, but the initials. Say, for example, if Archana A is going to practice this, whatever we're covering today, she's going to create a project with a name as AA. And if somebody has already used that name, so you say ARA. Okay, so use the initials from your first name and last name. And after you do that, you should be able to see the create a project for yourself, and whatever components you practice, you put it into that project. Okay, don't edit others projects. You create your own project and you put your components into it. So I'm going to create it as UG80. And when we create a project, you type in a name, identifier would be generated automatically. We need to enter the keywords and the description. And if you want to make the project open for all, you can tick this box so that anybody can edit it. We normally don't do this. And create a project. And the moment you create a project, remember I created this project as Prasad. So which means only Prasad will have access to it. Okay. Now, we'll come back to this in 5 to 10 minutes from now. We'll see how to add members and give them different privileges in 5 to 10 minutes from now. I'll go back here. Now I've created a project And in a project, yes, I can build integrations, and within the integrations, I can use the connections, lookups, and libraries. I can define them first and I can use them here. So I need to get started with the first REST API in OIC. And for this integration, we don't need to talk to Salesforce or ERP or HCM Cloud, but we still need a trigger connection to be created with a REST adapter, because we would use this connection as a starting point in the integration. Okay, so you go ahead and create a connection, and you need to choose the type as the REST here, because we want to expose this integration as a REST. So you select the REST adapter and you give it a name. I'm going to call it as Hello World, a REST connection. And as you type in name, you see identifier is generated automatically. And do you guys see any pattern here, guys? Do you see any pattern here?
Instead of
Underscore.
underscore.
Yeah, spaces replaced with underscore, everything converted to caps.
Capital letter.
Yeah. The moment you hit the create button, you cannot change the identifier. This acts like a primary key for the connection. But name is something that you can edit. And one important selection that you make when you create a connection is a role. Please pay attention here, guys, 200% attention. Next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about the significance of this role. And it is very, very important that you understand this in depth. Okay, no multitasking, no checking emails, guys. Please pay 200% attention here. So when you create a connection, you have to choose a role. And what are the 3 roles that are available? Trigger, invoke, trigger, and invoke. So when you create a connection, you choose a role. And after you hit the create button, you cannot change the role. Okay, so point 1, when you create a connection, you choose a role. Point 2, after you hit the create button, you cannot change the role. Now, when you create a connection, you have to choose a role, and for which you have 3 options: trigger, invoke, trigger, and invoke. You need to understand what exactly trigger is and what is invoke. So to explain this, to explain what is trigger and what is invoke, let me open a journal import service that we're going to build as a 4th integration, and it will be easy for me to explain it. And whenever you build an integration, the first connection that you have within the integration is called as a trigger connection. First node in the integration is called as a trigger connection. Another way to look at trigger connection is there is a payload coming into OIC. Remember, after we build this integration, HSBC core banking system is going to trigger this integration, and they are going to pass in a journal payload as input. They're going to pass in a journal batch with 100 lines as input here. So the trigger connection is a first node in the integration starting point, and you would also be receiving a journal payload. Another way to look at it is there is an incoming payload coming into, there's an inbound payload coming into OIC. There's an inbound payload coming into OIC. Okay, there's an inbound payload. There's an incoming message there's an inbound message into OIC, journal payload coming in from other system into it. And after we receive a journal batch, yes, HSBC core banking system would trigger your integration, pass in journal lines as input. What is it that we're doing within the integration, guys? Within the integration, I am invoking Oracle ERP Cloud connection. So you see a pop-up, guys, there. And in that pop-up, you will be able to see the first line is a role. It's an invoke. And the second line is a type of an adapter. It's an Oracle ERP adapter that is used to create this connection. So I'm using this Oracle ERP connection, role invoke. I'm using this ERP connection to invoke journal import service in ERP cloud. So meaning whatever 100 lines I received as input, I'm passing those 100 lines as input to journal import service. And after that, I'm also invoking ERP integration service. I'm using ERP connection again in the integration to invoke ERP integration service and submit ESS job. And after that, I'm invoking ERP integration, I'm using ERP cloud connection again to invoke ERP integration service to get the job status. So within an integration, the first node that you use is called as a trigger. It's an inbound message coming into OIC, it's an incoming payload. And any other connection that you use within the integration, is called as an invoke connection. Any other connection that is that we are invoking is called as an invoke connection. Okay, so what is it that we would do? So you have an incoming payload, you're calling a journal import service. And so whatever other connections that you have that you are invoking is called as an invoke connection. Why is it called as an invoke, guys? Because it could be a database connection that you might be using to invoke a procedure. It can be ERP connection to invoke a web service in ERP cloud, or it can be an FTP connection to invoke a write file operation. So since we are using this connection to invoke something in a different application, it is called as an invoke. Another way to look at invoke connection is it is an outbound message. It is a message going out from OIC to outside world. Here we are passing in journal lines. Here we are passing in details to submit the job. Okay. So trigger is a first node, incoming payload, inbound message. Invoke is any other connection that we use in the integration. And it's an outbound message going out from OIC. Now you guys know what is trigger and what is invoke. So when we create a connection, you will be asked whether you want to create this connection as a trigger or as an invoke. So if I create this connection as trigger, what does it mean, guys? It means that you can use this connection only as a starting point. Remember, guys, connections need to be leveraged. Connections, lookups, and libraries needs to be reused to the extent possible. So when you create a connection, so if I'm creating this connection with a role as trigger, that means I can use this connection to trigger any integration. I can use this connection to trigger any integration, but remember, I can use this connection only as a first node, guys. You cannot use it as a subsequent node. You cannot use it as a subsequent node. You can use it only as a first node. Okay. Now, and if I create a connection with role as invoke, what would happen, guys? That means I will not even see this connection in the drop down of trigger connections. When I click on a plus icon here, this connection will not even show up. And I'll be able to use this connection only as a subsequent node. Okay, so everybody clear with a trigger and invoke so far, right? But it gets complicated when I explain trigger and invoke. So this is clear. If you create a connection with role as trigger, you use it as a first node. If it is invoke, then you use it as subsequent nodes node, not as a first node. Now to explain the concept of trigger and invoke, role equal to trigger and invoke, let me make use of a ERP connection. It will be difficult to explain this with a hello world example. So what I would do is I would use ERP connection to explain this. And let's say one of you have started off with this integration. Okay, so let's say Prasad needs to build this integration first of all. And Prasad is the first one to build a ERP related integration in the project. He was given a task to build a journal import service. Now, what is Prasad supposed to do, guys? Before he builds the integration, what is he going to do? First of all, he needs to create the required connections. Yes or no, guys? Before he creates an integration, he has to create the required connections. So before Prasad creates this integration, he would create a trigger connection. He would create the trigger connection with a SOAP adapter. That's fine. Don't worry about it for now. And yes, the trigger connection is ready for this integration. And after that, in the integration, he needs to use ERP cloud connection. He needs to use ERP cloud connection to invoke multiple web services in cloud. Prasad needs to invoke multiple web services in cloud. Yes, I need to invoke journal import service. I need to invoke ERP integration service and so on. So Prasad needs to create an Oracle ERP cloud connection. So what is it that he does? Yes, assume that he has already created a trigger connection. Now he's creating ERP cloud connection. So he would pick up Oracle ERP cloud adapter and he would give it a name. Now, when he chooses a role for the connection, what role would be sufficient for this connection when you think about it only from this integration standpoint, guys? So what is Prasad going to do with this ERP connection that is creating here? With the ERP connection that is creating here, he would invoke journal import service. He would invoke ERP integration service twice here, right? So what role would be sufficient for the connection?
Invoke role.
Invoke is sufficient. So Prasad would go ahead and create an ERP connection with a role as invoke because he thought about the role for the connection only from this integration standpoint that he has to build. He would go ahead and create a connection and he would use this connection in the integration and he would build and deliver the service. And what is the important point that I mentioned before this, guys? Connections, lookups, and libraries needs to be reused to the extent possible. Now, point number one, if you build 100 integrations related to ERP cloud, how many ERP cloud connections do you think we should create, guys? Is it 100 or is it one?
One.
Absolutely. Now, what is the job of a connection, guys? Its job is only to establish connectivity with the system, guys. It has to be one per system. One connection to ERP, one connection to database, one connection to FTP. If you create 100 integrations related to ERP, you are not going to create 100 connections with ERP cloud. Nonsense. Okay, so you would only create one connection per system. Now let's say Prasad has created this ERP cloud connection, and when he assigned a role for that connection, he thought about a role only from his integration standpoint. Yes, I need to use this connection to invoke 2 or 3 services, so I created a connection with role as invoke. Tomorrow, Sudhakar needs to create another integration. Okay. Now, but in his integration, he has to start the integration based on or using ERP as a trigger. Okay. So one of my colleagues needs to build an integration, but that integration has to be triggered. As and when item is updated in ERP cloud. So meaning the other developer has to use ERP cloud connection as a trigger. So that whenever item is updated in ERP cloud, this integration will be triggered and we can send the details to the required destinations. Okay. So now tell me one thing, guys. When I created this integration, Before I created this integration, I created this connection and I selected role as invoke. I was able to achieve this use case. Will my friend or colleague, would he be able to use this ERP connection to start the integration, guys? To start his integration? Would he be able to use it as a trigger?
No, we need to create one more connection with the trigger.
Obviously, since I selected a role as invoke, if I create an integration and click on a plus icon, this connection itself will not show up in the trigger list. Can I change the role, guys, after I hit the create button?
No.
That is also not possible.
Not possible.
Right? Not possible. So what is the only option that is available? Like you rightly said, we don't have a choice but to create a duplicate ERP cloud connection or a second ERP cloud connection with a role as trigger. What we could have done to avoid the situation, guys? What else we could have done to avoid the situation?
We can create a role, a trigger, and invoke. Then we can use both.
Yeah. So when you're creating connections with generic systems like ERP cloud or a database or Salesforce or HCM cloud, if you are creating the connection, because you're building first ERP integration in a project, don't think about a role only from that integration standpoint. So when Prasad is creating this connection, Prasad should not think about a role for the connection only from the journal import service. Yes, journal import service standpoint, ERP is required only to invoke a couple of services, but what he should bear in mind that there would be plenty of other integrations created related to ERP down the line. And in those integrations, other developers might have to use ERP as a trigger. So especially when you're creating connections with the generic systems like ERP cloud, HCM cloud, database, or Salesforce, etc., common systems, it is always better to create the connection with a role as trigger and invoke. So that, yes, Prasad, when he created the connection, he should have used trigger and invoke. So that when he created this integration, he can use it as invoke. And when Sudhakar creates this integration, he can use the same connection as a trigger. Now, as I say this, there will be at least 5 out of 35 in the group who say, Prasad, I have a simple solution for your problem. What is that simple solution, guys? Why don't we create every connection as trigger and invoke? Yes or no, guys? Anybody with me on that? Why all this nonsense? Let's create every connection with role as trigger and invoke. Now you use trigger and invoke only for generic systems like ERP cloud or HCM cloud or any other system like that, guys. Because you cannot use trigger and invoke always. Say, for example, I'm creating a REST API here, right? I'm creating the REST trigger connection, and my intention is to use this connection to trigger my integration. So role equal to trigger would be sufficient for me. But going by your logic, what you said, let's create everything as trigger and invoke. Going by your logic, I go ahead and create this connection as trigger and invoke. Even though role equal to trigger is sufficient, I create the connection with the role as trigger and invoke. Now let's say create it. And after I create it, when I go into the connection details, it would ask me to enter what REST API do you want to invoke. Remember, when I created the connection, I said I want to use this connection as a trigger in some integrations and as an invoke, right? So when you have to use the connection as an invoke, what is it that you have to do? You need to mention, when you have to use the connection as an invoke, you need to mention which REST API do you want to invoke? What is the URL that you need to invoke? But do you have these details, guys? Like you said, I created all the connections with trigger and invoke. I created this connection with trigger and invoke. And until I test the connection, I cannot use it in the integration. And for me to test the connection, I have to enter the REST endpoint URL details here. So to keep it simple, whenever you're creating a connections with generic systems, whenever you're creating connections with generic systems like ERP Cloud or HCM or Salesforce, we normally go ahead and build the integrations with a role as trigger and invoke for generic systems. And when we create the connections with Yashasvi, can you go on mute, please? Yashasvi Maripati, can you go on mute, please? I was getting a lot of background noise, and that's why I've put you on mute. Yeah. So whenever you're creating explicit REST trigger connections, so whenever you're creating a connection and you know very well that you're going to use that connection only to trigger the REST API that you're going to build, in such cases, it's not a generic system. It is an explicit SOAP or REST trigger REST connections that you're creating. In such cases, you can pick and choose the required role. So I'm going to delete this connection because I don't have the required details to enter. So I'm going to create the connection back. With a role as trigger. I'm entering a name identifier as generated automatically. I want to use this connection to trigger the REST API. You can enter a keywords, any keyword that you want to tag to the connection if you want. Later on, when you want to search for the connection, you can search with the keywords or description or the name. And I'll come to this part later on. In 3 or 4 sessions from now, I'll explain all the miscellaneous options. So for now, you can just ignore this bit. Click on create. And I created a connection. And as soon as you create a REST trigger connection, the connection status would be 100%. And you're able to see 3 options here. Within the connection, we will be discussing about, we'll be discussing each of these options in quite detail later on. Okay, so there's a specific time to explain each and every concept, and I'll do it at that appropriate point in time. So for now, I just created a connection. It's 100%. Let's go back. And we need to go ahead and use that connection to start the integration. And the connection is in configured state. Now I go ahead and create an integration. And when you create an integration, we need to choose the appropriate style. We need to choose an integration style for it. And what are the styles that are available, guys? You have application, schedule, and event. We will be using application style in this integration. What does application style means, guys? It means that after you build the REST API, client will be triggering your integration from another application. And yes, I'm going to build this hello world REST API, and client would be triggering it from another application explicitly, and they would pass in a first name as input. So I go ahead and create it as application style, because when you use application style, after you build it, when you activate the integration, there would be a URL generated, and that URL is what we pass on to the other team. So I'm going to call it as UG80 Hello World REST API. Give it a name, identifier would be generated automatically, the same pattern. Everything converted to caps, spaces replaced with underscore. And there would be a version number that gets defaulted to 01.00.40. There are 3 bits in the version number. There are 3 bits in the version number. Major, minor, patch. Major and minor are 2 characters long. Major and minor are 2 characters long or 2 digits long. Patch is 4 digits long. So 2 plus 2, 4 plus 4, 8 with 2 dots in between. It is total 10 characters long. It is total 10 characters long. And whenever you build integration in OIC, the version number would default to 01.00.40. We are going to leave it that way until we do the administration session towards the end of the integration track. When we are about to close the integrations, we will do one administration session. And in that session, I'm going to talk about how you migrate the integrations from one instance to another instance, how do you version them, and how do you clone them. And in that session, we talk about versioning in detail. And until we do that, we will leave it as a default one. And yes, you can add some keywords that you want to tag to the integration if you want, and click on create. And it is, I've created an integration and it is prompting me, to configure a trigger connection. I've created a REST API. I've created a trigger connection, and I need to configure the trigger connection as a first node in the integration. But before I configure the trigger node, let's go back and knock off that pending concept. So we have one integration, we have one connection and one integration. And these are present within this project. And Prasad is the owner of this project. Now let's see what happens if another user tries to access this project. Okay, so let's give it a try. I'll go ahead and log in as, I'm going to log in as user one, the user that I've shared with you. I'm going to log in as user one into OIC instance, the user that I shared with you folks. I go into projects. Take off the username as filter. And I'm able to see the project that Prasad has created. And user one tries to get in. Would he be able to do it, guys? What does it say?
Doesn't have privileges.
Sufficient privileges.
User one doesn't have a privilege to come in. So if a HCM team member, so this is a benefit of using projects. If Divya tries to access a finance project, this is what she gets to see. Okay, HCM team cannot access finance integrations and finance team cannot access HCM. What if this user one is from my team and I need to grant access of this project? I need to grant access of this project to user one. But this person need not do any development. He just need to monitor the integrations that are running in the project. He doesn't have to do any development. He just have to monitor it. So what is it that I can do? I can add him or I can give him a monitor privilege. I can go in here and I search for user one. And I'm giving user one a monitor access on my project. And the moment I share it, what would happen is user one now have monitor access on my project. And if he tries to access it now, is he able to get in now, guys? He's able to get in. And there were 3 tabs in the project here. What is the only tab that is enabled for him? For this person, what is the only tab that is enabled?
Observe.
Observe tab. Since I've given monitor privilege to user one on my project, this person can get in and he can only observe or monitor the integration runs. And if something goes wrong, he can raise a flag and all that, do all that. So this would be appropriate for our support team members. What if this person not just have to monitor the integrations, but they should also be able to see the code as well. Not make any changes, but maybe to debug the integrations after they see some integration coming out, they should also be able to see the code and figure out what is wrong. They're not going to make the change, but they just want to see it or view it. So in such case, what I can do, Instead of giving him a monitor privilege, I'm going to give him a view access. And when I give him view privilege, what would happen? User would now be able to, and if he comes out and goes back in, he would now be able to see the other tabs as well. Earlier only observe was enabled, but the design and the deployer also enabled. And he is able to see the connections, integrations, everything is able to see. But what is it that he can perform? He can only view the code, guys. So for example, if I go into the integration here, since I'm the owner of this, it is prompting me to configure the trigger connection here. I mean, it is prompting me to, OIC is prompting me to proceed with the integration build. But let's see what this user gets to see when he goes into the API. When he goes into the API, you see that he has a view only access, meaning he can only see what is there in the integration, but he cannot build it. He cannot build it, guys. Do you see a plus icon here, guys? You don't see it, right? He cannot build it. He can only view it. Why is he only able to view it? Because that's a privilege that we have given him. Now let's say if this user has to work with me, if this user, let's say we both are colleagues. Let's say it's me who has created a project, and let's say user one is Dhaval. And he needs to work with me and build the fin related integrations with us. So I would go ahead and add the user one. I give this user an edit privilege. Edit means he can monitor it, he can view it, and he can also make some changes to it as well. And if I give him edit privilege, he would be able to get in. And he can start editing the integrations as well. He can start doing the build. Now you see, this guy is also able to proceed with a build now. Okay, so that's the three levels of access that you can give to a user on a project. Now you might see when you look at some of the components, integration, connections, or lookups or libraries, you might see sometimes the status of that component is locked. You see the status is locked. So let me explain that locking concept. So this integration is in draft status at the moment. And let's say Prasad starts editing it. Let's say Prasad starts editing the integration. And the moment a person starts editing an integration, OIC applies a lock on the integration immediately with a name as Prasad. And that lock will be released by OIC only when Prasad comes out of the integration. So I came into the screen, I've edited the integration, I'm in the edit screen. Any other developer, if he refreshes it, any other developer would see the integration as locked. And yes, of course, you can expand it and you can see who has locked it and when did they lock it. You can see this information. Okay, you can see who has locked it and when they have locked it, and you can wait for this person to release the lock. And after Prasad is done with the changes in the integration, if he comes out of the integration by clicking on this back button within the integration, remember guys, we don't use browser back buttons. Within the integration build screen only, you have a back button. Don't click on this back button. Click on this back button within the OIC. And when you come out, you would be able to see the lock released. So which means I can get into the integration and do the build now. So everybody clear so far? So whenever somebody starts editing an integration, OIC applies a lock. Now let's say Prasad started editing this integration and he's building it. It's like, assume that it is Friday evening and Prasad is in a hurry to shut down the laptop. He didn't click on the back button and he has closed the integration abruptly. Let's say I've done a force shutdown or I close this browser in a hurry to leave office. Quite possible, yes or no, guys? So does that, the lock that Prasad has applied on the integration, is that released, guys?
No.
You wait for 2 days, will it get released? You wait for 10 days, does it get released? Since Prasad didn't hit the back button to come out of the integration, the lock will be there forever. Now, say for example, if this person is waiting for me to release a lock, he waits for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, then he pings me, Prasad, are you still working on the integration? I'm waiting for 4 days. Can you release the lock so that I can make some changes in the integration? And what would happen if he tries to unlock the integration? Let's give it a try. User 1 trying to unlock an integration which is locked by Prasad. What does it say? Unlocking an integration is only allowed by the administrator. Unlocking an integration is only allowed by the administrator. Remember, guys, is this user, tell me guys, is user 1 an administrator or does he have a developer access? Can you make out from the menu options whether this guy is an administrator or not?
And developer option settings is not able to see.
Perfect. Since we are not seeing settings, this guy is a developer. And since there are only 2 persons who can unlock an integration, who are those 2 persons?
The person who created the integration and the administrator.
Perfect. So a person who has applied the lock himself can unlock it, or a person with admin privilege can unlock it. And user 1 didn't apply the lock, and user 1 is not an administrator. And this would be the typical scenario, guys, when you build integrations in OIC. You might not apply it, you might not apply a lock, or you might not have admin, you would definitely not have admin privilege. So in which case you cannot unlock the integrations created by others. So what do you do in such cases? You don't have a choice but to ask Prasad, ask him to release the lock. So Prasad would go in there and he would unlock the integration from here. Okay. And after he unlocks the integration, the other developer will be able to see the integration in a draft status, and he can proceed with the integration build. So whenever in OIC instance you see a term called locked, you now know the reason and you now know what's going on in the background. Right? Any confusion, guys, so far with locking?
No, we are clear.
Okay.
One question, Prasad.
Yes, please.
If it is logged, what are the restricted? Am I audible? Hello?
If it is
Am I
locked,
audible?
if it is locked,
then what
you-
are the operation cannot be done? Means can someone be
I'm editing the integration here, and I'm going to close it. And you see that integration is in lock state. This guy will not be able to do anything in this API.
invoke is also not possible?
Okay, you tell me it is possible. What do you see here?
View only.
What does view only means? You can only see it. You cannot do any other action. You can only view it. Okay, so you cannot perform any action on the integration whatsoever until Prasad releases a lock. Okay. Now we go back and log in as Prasad here, unlock the integration. Now we get into the API and we start building it. Now I need to configure the trigger connection. This is a first node in the integration. So I configure the trigger connection and you need to give it a name. So what do you want to call this endpoint as, guys? So what is it going to do? And also before I proceed with configuring the trigger connection, let me just change the connection. I'm going to give you guys a view only access on the project, and I'm doing it deliberately because people might edit the integrations in my project by mistake instead of editing it in your project. Okay, so only I should be able to edit the integrations in this project, and it should act as a reference for you when you build integrations. So I'm giving you, you in the sense user one, a view privilege on my project so that you can see whatever integrations am I building or whatever mappings that I'm doing, but you won't be able to change anything in it. Okay, I'm doing it on purpose so that whatever mappings or the integrations that I'm building here, it will remain intact. I go back and we need to configure the trigger connection first. I'm going to call it as say hello, give a name to the endpoint, and all this endpoint is going to do is whatever first name that you pass as input to it would prefix hello and send it back. Now, yes, give it a name and you can mention a description if you want. You can mention a description if you want and say it takes first name as input, prefix hello and send it back as a response. And we need to, and there's one more option here which says select to configure multiple verbs or resources. Remember guys, when you build integration in OIC, especially a REST API, from one REST API that you build, you can expose multiple branches if you want. From one integration that you build, you can expose multiple branches if you want. Let me open an integration and show you how it looks like. So when you build a REST API in OIC, from one single REST API, you can expose multiple branches. So for example, when we build the purchase order REST API, which is a fourth integration from now, when we build the purchase order REST API, a fourth integration from now, we will understand how to expose multiple REST endpoints from one single integration. So we'll see how to expose one endpoint to create a PO, another endpoint to get the PO details based on a PO header ID. So from one REST API, you can have multiple branches like this. And if you want to expose, or if you want to have multiple branches in your integration, then you will have to tick this box. So we'll check this box when we do this integration, and we will see how this works in it. But in this integration, remember, I don't want to have multiple branches, guys. I just want to configure only one branch. So resource, verb, branch, operation, everything means the same ways. So I don't want to expose multiple operations from here. We'll see how this works in a PO API. And I just go ahead and say continue. Now, what is this operation going to do, guys? It takes in first name as input, prefix hello and send it back. What are the details that we need to mention on a REST API, guys? If I go to a standard REST API, what are the details that we need to mention, guys? So for example, I go to Bank's REST API. What are the two important things you see on a REST API? You see a method and you see a relative path, which is called as URI, right? So even when you look at the standard APIs, you see those two details, the method and the path, and you see the same details here as well. Even when you're building a REST API in OIC, you need to choose a method and you need to mention a relative path there. And for this integration, yes, client is going to trigger our integration, pass in first name, and they want to get back greeting as a response. So since we are not doing any create or update operations here within the integration, we would select the method as the default method would be get, and we are going to leave it that way because all we have to do is, yes, client would pass in a first name and they want to get back a response. So since we are not doing any CRUD operations there, we will leave the method as get, which is a default one, which means if it is a get method, we cannot configure any request payload, but we can only pass in input parameters. Now in the relative path here, whatever is a relative path that you are entering here, it is going to show up at the end of the endpoint URL. So after we build the integration, when you activate it, there would be a URL generated, right? In that endpoint URL, at the end, you will be able to find this path. So what do you want to call this as, guys? So you say slash say hello slash. Remember, I need to receive first name as input into the integration. So what are the two parameters that are possible in REST API, guys? What are two ways to receive input parameters into REST API? One is a template parameter. One is a template parameter, or this is also called as URI parameter. And how do you define template parameter, guys? You just have to put a slash, and in the curly braces, you mention the template parameter or a query, sorry, or a URI parameter name. So if I want to receive first name as input, I have to say hello slash first name in curly braces. Now, when I mention say hello and first name in curly braces in the relative path, when we activate the API, how would that endpoint URL would look like, guys? The endpoint URL for this REST API is going to look something like this. Endpoint URL is going to look something like this. So after I activate this REST API with the relative path as say hello and first name, endpoint URL that get generated would look like this. First of all, you have OIC instance link. And after that, you have this common suffix. After that, you have this common suffix, which says IC API integration V2 flows REST. And then you have the project name. Until here, so whatever is a path that I have highlighted, it is a common prefix for any REST API you build. Any REST API you build in this OIC instance, this would be a common prefix. And after that, you have a project and you have a project name, project name. And then you have the integration name. Then you have the integration name, followed by the version number. Whatever is a version that you have a version number. And at the end of the version number, this is where you will see, the relative path. This is whatever relative path that you enter here will be showing up at the end of the endpoint URL. So until REST is a common prefix, doesn't matter what REST API you call it, you create in this OIC instance, this would be the common prefix. Then you have the project name, integration identifier, version number, and the relative path. Okay. Now, when you see the relative path here, you say hello first name and last name. You see the relative path here. Whatever path that you mention, it would be showing up like this in the endpoint URL. And when client triggers your integration, if you have first name and last name as configured as template parameter, when client triggers your integration, in place of first name and last name, they would be passing in the actual values like this. Okay. Say, for example, if I have to receive only first name as input, I mention slash say hello slash first name. And the moment you mention something in curly braces here, OIC will force you to review the parameters. OIC will force you to review the parameters. And you can click on continue. And in the next screen, you will be able to see two sections here, query parameters and template parameters. I'll come to query in a moment. If you look at the template parameter section, whatever you mention in the curly braces here, that is showing up as a template parameter. That is showing up as a template parameter here. And the data type that would be assigned by default would be string, and you can change it if you want. By default, whatever you mention in curly braces in the URI or a path will be created as template parameters. We don't have an option to add or remove. Do you see add or remove here, guys? You see add or remove for query parameters, but do you see those buttons for template? We don't see it, right? Which means where are these parameters coming in from? In the path, whatever you mention in curly braces will be defined as template parameters by default. So if I go back, and let's say I need to receive both the first name and last name as input. How many parameters will we see now, guys?
2 parameters.
So whatever you mention in the curly braces here, first name and last name, so those two you will be seeing here, and you can assign a data type.
Yes.
So this is one way to receive inputs into REST API. Put them within the curly braces so that they will be defined as template parameter by default. And when you put when you put them in curly braces in the URI, in the endpoint URL that is generated, it would, client would be able to see the template parameters, and they can pass in the actual values when they call our integration. What is another way to receive inputs into REST API, guys? Template parameter is one way. A second way to receive input parameters into REST API is using query parameters. So what if I want to receive first name and last name, not as template parameters, but as query parameters? What do I have to do? I go back and I take them off from the path, and I go to the next screen. Do you see a template parameter section here, guys?
No,
Section itself has gone missing. Why is it missing?
because we removed the
Yeah, because in the path I've removed all the template parameters. And how do you define the query parameters? Query parameters have to be defined explicitly. You have to click on a plus icon, and you have to say f name of data type string, and let's say L name, first name and last name of data type string. So you need to define the query parameters explicitly by clicking on add or remove buttons here. And if you have defined first name and last name as query parameters, not template parameters, when you activate the integration, how would the endpoint URL would look like, guys? A common prefix, project, integration name, version number, and only the path that you mentioned here, URI, only that you will be able to see here. Remember, there are no template parameters, right? But when a client is going to call our integration, how are they going to pass in the template parameters, the query parameters? They would say question mark. At the end of the endpoint URL, they put a question mark, and they have to say q equal to, and we say first name equal to Sachin, question mark, q equal to first name equal to Sachin, and a last name equal to Tendulkar. So if it is defined as a query parameter, you will not see it in the path. And when you call the API, you need to put a question mark at the end, and you say q equal to first name and a last name. First name and the last name. So this is how you do it, first name and the last name. Now the obvious question that everybody is waiting to ask. What is that question, guys? What's the obvious question? When to use what, right? So when we have to receive an input into the REST API, I can receive it either as a template parameter or as a query parameter. But when should I use template and when should I use query? it is difficult to explain when to use template or query with a Hello World REST API. But if you take a purchase order REST API, I can easily explain it. So when you build a purchase order REST API, let's say you're building this p4 REST API, and I need to expose multiple branches from this endpoint. One endpoint will be post branch, and client would trigger this post endpoint, pass in purchase order details. And in this branch, I'm going to plug in logic to go to ERP, create a PO there. And a client has asked me to expose a get endpoint. Client has asked me to expose a get endpoint. And in this get endpoint, they're going to pass in PO header ID as input. And I need to get the PO details based on PO header ID, which is a primary key. Now, when you have to receive an input into the REST API, and if that is a primary key, and when you hit the database with that input, you get only one record. What parameter is appropriate for such use cases, guys? You get a PO header ID and you need to get the PO details. What parameter is appropriate for that use cases, guys?
Template.
Template parameter. And let's say, let me change the requirement a little bit here. I want you to give, yes, this endpoint is very much required, but I also want you to give me another endpoint here, another branch here. And to that branch, I'm going to pass in buyer name as input, and I need to get all the POs raised by that buyer. Or I want to pass in business unit as input, and I want to get all the POs raised in that PO. Oh, sorry, in that business unit, in that BU. So I would get a supplier or buyer or any other input, and that needs to be applied as a filter, and we need to get all the POs which satisfy that filter. So how are we going to configure that parameter, guys? Whether it is a BU or a buyer name or supplier name, what is more appropriate for it?
Query parameter.
Query parameter. Okay. So to keep it simple, when you have to decide whether to use query or a template, ask yourself one simple question. Is the input that I'm getting, is it a primary key, yes or no? If it is a primary key, go for template. If it is not a primary key, go for query. As in this case, if it's a PO header ID, go for template. If it is a supplier or buyer or any other name, you go for query because you are basically querying the resource with that filter. Okay. Now, in case of Hello World REST API, it doesn't. You can use either template or query, guys. Doesn't really matter because we're not getting into DB to fetch any details there. So I'm going to remove these two, and I'm going to go back. I'm going to define one template parameter there. And also another important point, guys. I often see people coming to a conclusion that it is either a template or a query parameter that we have to use. Is that a right assumption, guys? Can we have only one of them or can we have both? We can have both as well, guys. On an endpoint, we can have we can define a template parameter, and you can also define query parameters as well, guys. Absolutely not a problem. So I'm entering first name as a template parameter here, and the moment you put something in curly braces, OIC forces you to review the parameters. And since it is a get method, you cannot configure a request payload. When would this be enabled, guys? Only if it is a post or a put or patch method. Only if it is one among these three, it would be enabled. Only when it is post or patch or put, it would be enabled. If you select get or delete, it would be disabled immediately. And tell me one thing is, after client triggers our REST API, they would pass in first name as input and they want to get back a response. So I need to enable this endpoint, configure this endpoint to receive the response, because after client triggers the REST API, they would pass in first name and they want to get back greeting in the response. So we need to tick this box, configure this endpoint to receive the response, continue. And I'm going to leave the data type as string. That's fine. Continue. And we need to configure the response payload. We need to configure the response here. And in the response, remember REST API, what payload format does a REST APIs use, guys?
JSON.
JSON, and that is selected by default here. And remember, REST APIs would also work with XML, but we never ever do that, because if you do that, see why REST APIs are preferred? Why do they give better performance when compared to the SOAP services? Because they use JSON, which is pretty simple and lightweight. Yes, you can still use XML with REST API, but if you do it that way, you lose that performance benefit. So I select JSON sample. I select JSON sample. And I'm going to, and we can upload a sample file here. We can upload a sample file here. And when we upload a sample file, what is it that you're going to get here, guys? You can upload a sample file if it is a pretty complex JSON, or if it is a simple JSON payload, you can also enter it in line. You can upload a JSON file if you want, or you can also enter it in line. So you click on inline, and after you click on inline, you do have an option to enter a JSON payload here, sample JSON. Now, what is it that we want to send back in the response, guys? The only thing that I want to send back in the response is one attribute called greeting. And you know very well how a JSON payload looks like, right? Entire payload goes into curly braces, and you pass in greeting in quotes, and you can assign any sample value here. And this sample JSON is also given in the PPT. It's also given in the PPT. Curly braces, greeting in quotes, colon, and the value. Now, when you click on continue, now, if you want to send out only one attribute in the response, this is how you do it. And what is OIC going to do with this hello ABC, guys? This value will be looked at by OIC to determine what data type is appropriate for this. Don't think that when client triggers the API, hello ABC will go out. Whatever value that you assign to the greeting in the integration, that will go out. This will be used only to determine what data type is appropriate. If you probably, instead of hello ABC, if you say 1, 2, 3, greeting attribute would be created with a data type as number. But if you say hello ABC, it would be created with a data type as string. You can use a sample data. And what if I want to send back another attribute in the response? I just have to copy and paste it. So if I want to send back, say, multiple attributes like greeting, greeting 1, 2, and 10, you can just go ahead and put them as a comma separated list and enter it. So I want to send out only greeting in the response, and I've entered that sample payload, continue. And the moment you configure a trigger with a response payload in it, the message exchange pattern would be request response, and you see that there is a response that you have configured in the trigger node. The moment you click on finish, apart from configuring a trigger node, OIC will also add 2 more nodes. OIC will say, okay, Prasad, looks like you want to send back a response. So let me help you a bit here. So OIC will automatically add the response element. And before it sends a response, we would also have to assign a value to it. We would also have to assign a value to it. Right? So here you are sending back greeting, but before you send back greeting, you obviously want to assign value to greeting, right? So that's why you see a response element, and you also see a mapper there, and you also see a mapper there. And until the mappings are done, until the mappings are not done, you will see the dotted line. And once the mappings are done, you would see a solid line like this. And when the trigger, when these nodes are added, the default layout that you see would be vertical layout. You also have horizontal layout option, horizontal and vertical. And in vertical, there is also another option called outline. When you select outline, what would happen? you would be able to see the complete details of each and every node. Say, for example, for this trigger node, you see what is the connection and what adapter is used in that connection. So all the details would be available in the outline. Go to vertical and you go ahead and save it. Okay, so this is how you build a REST API in OIC. This is how you build a REST API in OIC. And we need to get into the mapper and we need to talk about all the options that we see in that screen. Let's park it for tomorrow. Any questions, guys, in what we did today?
Regarding the template parameters, we are using the simple format, but in query parameters, if you want to define a complex structure like a parent attribute and a child attribute, will that can be added through the query parameters? For example, we have kind of employee. Under employee, we have name and date of birth, which is a child's.
Now, what you need to understand is, if it is a get endpoint, you configure parameters, whether it is a URI or a template, template or query parameters. And those parameters are not of complex data types. They are pretty simple one field attributes that you pass.
Yes.
If you're building an API to create an employee, okay, and you need to receive not just one field or two fields, you receive 100 fields as input. And there would be a master detail in it. You have employee details, you have assignment details, you have name details, etc. So that would be a different story altogether. And you would build that API not as a get method, but as a post method. And if it is a post method, you can configure a request payload. And in the request payload, you can have any number of levels of nesting in it.
Okay.
Okay, and that is exactly what we will be covering in the purchase order. Remember, in the purchase order, we need to create a PO. How many fields do you think we need to receive as input to create a PO? Shall I show you a sample payload? It is going to look something like this. It's going to look something like this. So you would have header, you would have lines, again a repeating array. One PO could have multiple lines, and within the lines you have schedules, and within the schedules you have distributions, and you have n levels of nesting with arrays in it. So this is not what we are dealing with. We are dealing with a get endpoint. When we do a post endpoint, we talk all about that.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. See you tomorrow.